Hi everyone. In this short video here, what we're going to look at is the idea of efficient strategy versus a responsive strategy. When we're looking at supply chain, what we're interested in is really how do you want to do business and how do you want your supply chain to operate in addition to your factory. And there's fundamentally two categories of choices. I can choose to be efficient. So in our case, I can look to say I want to be the Walmart of orange juice, or I want to be responsive to the customer. I want to be the Nordstrom of orange juice. If you're looking for a little better example, a place you can look actually would be hamburgers. If you look at an efficiency strategy, you can look at McDonald's as an example. Their objectives are get it to you quick and do it at a very low cost versus a responsive strategy might be there's a burger chain called The Counter in many of the major cities, and a hamburger that's a dollar and a half at McDonald's is about $10 at the counter. But they really focus on the quality, flexibility, or dependability. So it's very difficult to be both. You typically have to look at playing on one side or the other, so to speak, efficiency or responsive, and then make decisions or tackle issues that say, for these issues, here's how I want to respond. So in the simulation, again, you're looking at it in a sense, do I want to be the Walmart of orange juice? Or do I want to be the Nordstrom of orange juice? And I want to make decisions that support that and align with that. So what I want to look at here is a number of issues on the left column that we look at in operations and supply chain, and what are the typical characteristics under a responsive or an efficient strategy. Some of these you'll be making decisions with in the simulation, some you will not. But the idea behind it is pick a strategy, left side or right side, and then for the issues that you have, make a decision that's supportive of it. So for an example here, when we look at performance objectives, typically, not always, but typically when we're looking at efficiency, we're dealing with a objective of being the lowest cost or the fastest speed. And so we look at measurements such as throughput for speed, how fast can I get it through? Or if I'm trying to be low cost, I may look at it and say, well, I need to turn my inventory real fast and real quick so that I can have the lowest cost. Whereas in responsive, you could compete on quality, could compete on flexibility, could compete on dependability. And so some comparable measures for those might be, if I want to be dependable, my measurement might be the appropriate level of safety stock. Or if I look at flexibility, I may measure mix and volume and my ability to respond to those changes in flexibility. And then quality, of course, error free. With those two strategies of responsive or efficient, then typically there's two types of layouts. If I'm in an efficient strategy and I'm keeping things very inexpensive and fast throughput, then I'm going to lay out my factory typically in a cell or a continuous flow or some form of it, assembly line. Where responsive, things tend to be more job or batch or move through in batches. I don't necessarily have the volumes, but I have lots of variety. So that's why you see typically in a responsive strategy, responsiveness, I'm dealing with changes in mix and volume, so I'm dealing with low volumes and high variety because the customer is saying, hey, I want you to be flexible on what you make for me. So I don't have the money to set up necessarily, or the justification to set up a cell or continuous flow, so I'll stay in a job shop, make to order, batch type environment. Whereas if I'm cranking out the same thing all the time, my volumes tend to be high, my variety tends to be low, and because volumes are high and I don't change over very much, then I can afford to invest the money in the automation for a cellular layout. Some of the other things that are part of the strategies, if you look at your scheduling for MRP, materials requirements planning, or factory scheduling, if you're making the same thing all the time, then I can just build to a rate. I don't need a shop order. A shop order's role typically is a place to collect labor and materials. And that makes sense to issue individual purchase orders or shop orders when the variety is going to be really high and everything's different and they're low volumes, every job's unique. So I have to issue individual shop orders to be able to capture all that unique labor and material. Whereas on the efficiency side, it doesn't make sense to cut shop orders every hour for the same thing. Let's just tell people, hey, build to a rate. So let's kind of scoot down here for a second and let's look down at some of the rate-based stuff here. If we look at shop floor control, again, typically I'm going to look at individual shop orders because I need to collect the individual labor on the floor. Whereas, again, the control on the shop floor is going to be rate-based. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to control by you meeting 100 per hour is your build rate. And I'm not going to do any additional control unless I find out you're making less than 100 an hour. And so from a releasing inventory standpoint, we tend to backflush. In other words, the bill of materials good, I'm making the same thing every time, so let's just flush out the inventory at the time we receive rather than release the material to the individual shop order and receive in at the end. Capacity wise, what we end up looking at here is capacity then has got to be really high. It's really got to be infinite almost for responsive strategy because you never know what you're going to make because the variety is so high. In a rate-based situation here, we tend to operate in a finite basis. In other words, we cap off our capacity because we know what the rate is, so I can build to that capacity. I don't have to staff for infinite. That infinite capacity is just going to be a waste because I'm only building to the same rate. Organizational charts in a responsive strategy, the org chart tends to be very flat, not a lot of layers between top leadership and frontline operations because decision making's got to be decentralized at the local front troops front line, where the org chart tends to be very hierarchical in an efficiency strategy because pennies matter. And an example would be I've got one purchasing person who's making decisions for all the different areas. So we're very hierarchical and we're very centralized. From the getting the work done standpoint, the execution, we tend to push in anticipation. In other words, because the variety of jobs is very high, we never know what we're going to get. So we get the job and then we have to push it through the factory, or we forecast what we think we're going to build and we push the order out to the factory floor in anticipation of the customer order coming in. On the efficiency side, because we're making the same thing all the time in a continuous cell, we can have like a two-bin or a Kanban or a pull system. So we pull through production in response to actual orders that came in and pulled from finished goods. So it's kind of a push versus pull response here. So let's come back and look a little bit further in terms of setups. Setups tend to be much higher in a differentiation, or also called responsive strategy, because you're changing over all the time, so you can have more setups versus the low cost provider efficiency, the Walmart of orange juice. You're going to set up once and keep cranking away, so a lot less setups. You're also going to have a lot less work in process, a lot less material queuing up in front of the job, a lot less material waiting to move to the next operation. Your move times are real quick, and your throughput times are really quick, because once the part gets through the first operation, it moves right on to the second operation because you're making the same thing all the time. Whereas in the responsive, and you're in high variety batches all the time, again, more setups. You're going to have more work in process because more unique jobs are sitting out on the floor because you're pushing through in anticipation. Therefore, you're going to have more things queued up in front of workstations waiting to go through. More wait time because the first part's got to wait for the rest of the batch to get produced before it moves on. So therefore, longer move times. And because I got more queue, wait, and move time, I've got more throughput time. Staffing. Cross-training's good. We see that way down here at the bottom. We've got to be able to cross-train everywhere, and everybody's got to have that kind of flexibility. But what we're saying here is people have to be more flexible because I could get a different job every time. So staffing's got to be more flexible, and I could get moved to different jobs. Whereas the dedicated part in a low cost or efficient strategy, I very easily could be stuck in front of one operation only, and so I'm dedicated to that piece of equipment. But again, we do want people cross-trained all the time from a skill level standpoint, even though they may only stay in one spot. So let's move down a little bit further. From a control of the factory standpoint, we tend to operate by exception in the low cost efficiency. In other words, if you're making 100 per hour, I'm going to assume silence is golden unless I don't see 100 coming off the end of the line every hour, so I operate by exception. Whereas in a push strategy or the differentiation responsive, we call it traditional apex control, but really what we're saying here is, every job's got to be reported at every operation as it moves through the factory, and I kind of have to shove things through. So there's a traditional control environment. From a capacity, we're not so much talking infinite and finite here as far as bringing on capacity, because I could get an order at any time and it's different every time. Then I may want to bring in equipment and be ready. So I'm going to lead with buying equipment and having it ready in anticipation of a variety of orders. Whereas in the low cost provider standpoint, when we talk about lag, the business owner, business leader, he or she is saying, I'm not going to bring on a piece of equipment unless we've got the business and the volume, because I've got to set up a whole dedicated line here. And if I don't use it, that's costing me money, and I'm competing in a low cost strategy. So I'm going to lag on adding capacity unless I know darn well that I need it. We tend to build in that environment also in a level production strategy. So if someone comes to you and says, I want 365,000 pieces per year, and we're working 24/7, you and I are going to look at that and go, okay, 365,000 divided by 365 days, that's 1,000 a day. We're going to build at 1,000 pieces per day. So that's our takt time, TAKT, or our rate of customer demand. Versus a production strategy here, we're going to be up and down all over the place because we've got variety in the types of orders and the time, so we tend to chase orders. Organizationally, besides being much flatter in the responsive side of things, the organization tends to be much more decentralized. Decision making versus the org chart, decision making is much more at the front lines. As a president, CEO, VP of supply chain or operations, I'm going to cede control to the frontline operator because he or she's closest to the customer in terms of meeting these needs of flexibility or dependability. Much more centralized in the low cost provider strategy or the efficiency, because cost is important and pennies are important. So I want control over who buys what and how I schedule, so I can find the most optimized, efficient way to be able to run my business. So really what it comes down to is, what side are you going to play on? Are you going to play on the left side, differentiation or responsive? Or am I going to be on the right side, efficient or low cost? Tough to be both. One last example and then we'll stop. From a department store standpoint, would be to think of Sears. Sears has struggled for years to find their niche, because on one level they're trying to compete with the Walmart, but on the other side they're trying to be like a Nordstrom and meet the higher end. And it's tough to exist in both worlds out there. So as you tackle strategies in the simulation, don't think too deep. Come up with your strategies, make your decisions so that they line up left side or right side, but don't think too deep. Think in terms of left side, right side. Am I competing on being responsive? Am I competing on a low cost? So I'm going to turn it back to your faculty member here at this point to kind of add the nuances from their experiences. Thank you.